Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Vanessa. I am the co-host of the Urban Roots podcast, and I'm super excited to kind of moderate a conversation today about Biddy Mason. So let me just quickly take you through the overview of today's event. Can everybody see that screen? Is that great? Coming up, great. So quickly, our agenda for today, just so you know what's in store for you. It's lots of exciting stuff. I'll kick us off. I'll do some introductions, introduce you to the Urban Roots podcast in case you're not familiar with it. And then I will also introduce you to our very esteemed panel of guests today. We have some incredible historians, activists on the line who are going to talk to us about Biddy Mason. And so these are all folks who are part of the Biddy Mason Collaborative. And so you'll get to learn more about their work as well as the incredible life of Biddy. And we will also have a special guest appearance from Gen Bernstein. He's going to talk about the Los Angeles African-American Historic Places Project, which is really exciting and really has a lot to do with, really intersects with the story of Biddy and Los Angeles and the need to preserve places that are significant to African-American history. So really excited that he agreed to join us. And at the very end, you will get a chance to ask us questions. It won't just be me asking questions. So if you are wondering about something as you're listening to the event, feel free to put it in the chat. Decca, my co-host, is going to be compiling all your questions. And as we get to the end, she'll surface those and read those for us. So you can either put in questions as they come to you in the chat, or you can wait until the end for those last 10 minutes and put them in then. So that's the agenda for today. So really quickly, just to introduce you to me and my organization, Urban Roots is a podcast that I work on with Decca, who I'll introduce in a second. But we are a narrative documentary podcast from Urbanist Media, which is an anti-racist community preservation not-for-profit in Cincinnati that Decca started. And what we do is we unearth urban histories, particularly urban histories of women, of people of color that are in danger of being forgotten. And we've had we just finished our second season, which was very exciting. First season was all about Cincinnati history, looking at 3 African-American neighborhoods there. And this season, we went to Brooklyn, to Indianapolis, and to Los Angeles. And in that 2-part series, we told the story of Biddy Mason. Who are we? Just very quickly. Hello, I'm Vanessa. I'm the co-host of Urban Roots. I'm a journalist, cities journalist. You may have heard me on my other podcasts. I'm the host of City of the Future, as well as Uncertain Things. And Decca is my co-host. She is the kind of brainchild of Urban Roots. She's a historic preservationist out in Cincinnati. Decca, you want to say hello really quick? If she can unmute. No, I have no power to unmute you.
Hello. Hi.
There she is.
I'm Decca. Nice to see you all. Thank you all for joining us.
Yes. And Decca started Urban Roots mostly because she, as a historic preservationist, kept seeing places of historical significance to people of color getting demolished, getting erased, not really being talked about or preserved in the profession. And so the podcast is a way that we can do that through story. And our final trio member here is Connor Lynch. He's also on screen somewhere if you want to say hello, Connor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here.
You usually don't hear Connor's voice if you listen to the podcast, but he's the one who makes it into radio. We write it down and he makes it beautiful. So thank you, Connor, for bringing your documentary film skills to bear. So that's the Urban Roots team. And to kick us off, before we get into our conversation, I'm going to play a very brief clip from the first episode of our Biddy Mason series. And this, I believe, is the first 3 minutes of the episode. So it'll give you a little bit of context into Biddy Mason, but also how one of our panelists first learned about Biddy Mason. So I'll play this clip and then we'll dive into our conversation.
So I don't remember the exact minute, but it is very likely it was in spring 2013, and I was probably sitting in the reading room at the Huntington Library.
That's Laura Voisin George.
I am an architectural historian and a native of Southern California.
Back in 2013, Laura was considering a PhD and was researching one of California's first successful surgeons, Dr. John S. Griffin.
And on one of those long sessions of library reading, she came across a useful resource.
In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a UCLA medical lecturer named Viola Lockhart Warren, And she wrote a series of articles about early Anglo doctors in Southern California.
One of those articles contained a historical detail that struck Laura as pretty odd. Warren wrote about a series of 10 murals that, at the time, adorned the walls of UC San Francisco's medical school.
The series was painted by a Polish immigrant named Bernard Zackheim, a disciple of Diego Rivera, and it was called The History of Medicine in California.
So there's 10 panels. There's a chronological linearity to them, and that you have the Native Americans sharing their herbal medicine, the Anglo doctors on one side. Then you see the development of more formally trained surgeons. It was a graphic representation of the history of medicine in California. The medical students there should know.
Viola Lockhart Warren's article included an image of one of the 10 panels
that portrays Dr. Griffin with a Black nurse working beside him on a patient. They're standing over a stretcher that has probably an unconscious soldier wrapped up in a blanket. So it's just intriguing that, there is this woman of color and she has become a nurse and she's working next to the leading doctor and surgeon in Los Angeles. And it's just like, I kind of want to know more about this.
So Laura started digging and found out this nurse's name, Biddy Mason.
The fact that Biddy is one of the pioneers of California medicine is only one small part of her large story.
In June 2020, Laura wrote a blog post that described the remarkable highlights of Biddy Mason's life, including how she went from being enslaved in the South during the early part of the 19th century to becoming one of the wealthiest women in the American West by the time she died in 1891.
I first came across Biddy's story because of Laura's article, and I was instantly blown away. For years, information about Biddy has been hard to come by. Biddy was barely in the footnotes of historical texts. Even the fact that she was featured in these murals was almost lost to history.
But historians like Laura, and some other crusaders who we'll soon introduce you to, are keeping Biddy's story alive. And in this episode, so are we. I feel like that's a good spot to leave it, with lots of anticipation for the rest of the episode, as well as the theme song, which I love. But I think with that, I would love to introduce you to our panelists today.
So,
Okay, so you've just heard the voice of Laura. Don't be fooled. But she's also here in real life. But Laura Voisin George is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And she's also an architectural historian who works for ASM affiliates. So you'll be hearing from her. You'll also hear from Professor Sarah Barringer Gordon, or Sally. Sally is a professor of law and history at the University of Pennsylvania and the co-founder of the Biddy Mason Collaborative. She is also the co-author of Unlikely Freedom, Slavery, Race, and Law in Antebellum California. And last but certainly not least, we have Jackie Broxton, who is the executive director of the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation, which provides services and support to current and former foster youth. Jackie is also a playwright, a member of Fame Church, and a native Angelino. So I'm so excited to have these three ladies here with us today. Connor, would you mind pinning us so we can get into a conversation between us?
Yes, just trying to track down Jackie's screen name. She's believe she's using her name.
Well, maybe if the three panelists could unmute and say hi, that might make it easier.
Hello, this is
Hi.
Sarah.
Hi, this is Jackie.
hello, this is Laura Voisin George.
Found you. There you go. Boom. All right, we got everybody.
Great. So are we now off of the... Do I need to stop sharing my screen, Connor, for it to work?
No, everybody's here. Your screen and
I'm giving everyone a sneak peek. Okay, great. All right, so let's get into this conversation. So I want to start with Sally, with you, if you don't mind. I would love if you wouldn't mind just giving the audience a little bit of an introduction into your background, how you got into this field of history, how you discovered Biddy, and the origins of the Biddy Mason Collaborative.
Oh, I'd be happy to. I'm trained as a lawyer, and I also went to seminary. And then I did a PhD in history, largely because I think the history of religion in the United States is way understudied, especially from the perspective of church and state. And I was at the Huntington, a bit like Laura, researching, and came across materials in the records of courts related to Biddy Mason as a witness as a testator, meaning after she died, her estate was probated. And that's really how I came to her, because she had first no legal existence, and then after she gained her freedom, a very important role in the life of Los Angeles and a steady legal presence as well.
And so when did the Biddy Mason Collaborative come into being?
It really came into being after a group of us started talking about the importance of her story. And in particular, a group sat around outside the library and started talking about it. Two of us put together an application to the National Endowment for the Humanities, my co-author, Kevin Waite, but we began working very closely with others quickly. And one of the first people we met and were deeply impressed with is Jackie Broxton, the CEO of the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation. And of course, Laura Voisin George as well. And so one of the things that has happened as a result of working on Biddy is meeting people like you, Vanessa, and Decca and Connor, but also others who are interested in recovering history, using it to rethink the past and our relationship to it, and to understand how struggles for justice are old and deep.
And I think we're definitely going to get back to this theme of recovering history and how we rethink the past as we build our present or preserve our present. But before we get there, I do want to give folks who may not have listened to the episode yet a little bit more of an understanding of just how extraordinary Biddy Mason's story is. I am going to ask each of the panelists to kind of talk from their area of expertise. But Sally, since we started with you, let's start at maybe one of the more unique aspects, perhaps, of Biddy's story, which is the way that she earned her freedom. We tell the story in the podcast, but it's really remarkable. Can you talk about the freedom suit that Biddy took part in, and I guess why it was unique, and also how it changed California history?
Of course I can. And so that's one of the interesting issues, which is that across the United States, the legality of slavery was litigated by people who were enslaved and about people who were enslaved. And so often it's through court records that we first learn details about them. And that's the case with Biddy Mason. She was enslaved by a Latter-day Saint who migrated from Mississippi to Utah Territory to Salt Lake in 1848. He then, along with other Latter-day Saints, continued to found a Mormon colony in San Bernardino in 1851. There was a significant enslaved population there. Not only people of African descent, but many natives as well. And the colony was rich, very successful, very quickly. It grew more grain within 2 years of its founding than Santa Barbara County, Los Angeles County, and San Diego County combined. Just that one city, one colony. But Robert Smith fell out with the leaders of the Mormon Church, and in late 1855 decided to leave. And he planned to go to Texas with the 13 people he held in slavery, including one who was in the very final stages of a pregnancy and gave birth on only a couple of weeks after he started. And he traveled first south to the Santa Monica Hills, where sheriffs came to notice him. And we do not know who complained to the LA County judge, but 2 sheriffs certainly were among them, and likely members of the free Black population as well. And they filed for a petition of habeas corpus, which is lawyer speak. It's law Latin, as we call it. It means produce the body. And it's designed to protect people against illegal imprisonment or kidnapping or confinement. And the writ of habeas corpus was served on Robert Smith very late at night, probably into the new year, January 1st, 1856. And all 13 enslaved people were brought to the LA County, where they were initially put in the LA County jail for their own safety.
Mm-hmm. And so then this is the trial that sets up how Biddy earns her freedom. So I guess we talk about this in the podcast, but it's unique that, first of all, that this was such a large trial. As you said, 13 people were enslaved. And this was, I believe, one of the largest, what they call freedom suits in the country at that time. And then what's especially unique to me anyway, is that Biddy essentially testifies. So would you mind talking about that, her testimony, and also and the implications of it? And also, if Jackie or Laura, if you want to jump in at any points, feel free also to add your perspective.
Yes, well, the right to testify was one of the first rights that was removed from people of African, Native, and soon Chinese descent in California state history. And the capacity to testify is one of the precious legal rights of American citizens. And I know it sounds intimidating, but having your say is very important. So there were two of the members of the enslaved people kept by Robert Smith testified. The first was actually Hannah Smith, the other adult woman, who was called by Robert Smith and testified in open court. The second, and was clearly extremely intimidated and did not feel safe saying what she really wanted. The second was Biddy Mason, who the judge brought into his chambers along with two independent advisors, people that Laura George would call the American Dons, people who were highly regarded elite members of the LA community. And the judge asked her questions. Did she want to go to Texas? What did she feel about, what had Robert Smith told her about Texas? And Biddy said very clearly that she had always done what she had been told, but ever since she had learned about Texas, she had been afraid of going there. One of the things that Robert Smith told her was that she would be as free in Texas as she was in California. And it's fair to say she was not free in California when he told her that. But Texas also prohibited any immigration of a free Black into the state. So she would be taken literally only as a slave to Texas. That was the law.
Mm-hmm. And so when the juror decides in a sense, well, it's a little bit legally ambiguous. He didn't actually decide in their favor, but Robert Smith runs away, and by de facto, Biddy and the 12 others are essentially emancipated, I guess, and as a result, this has repercussions throughout California. Can you? And I'm going to go quickly to Laura in a second, because I do want to get to what Biddy does with her freedom, which is so extraordinary. But can you just very briefly, Sally, just talk about what it meant for California when this result was kind of announced?
I'd be delighted to, because one of the truths about California history is that one of the most important people in that history is Biddy Mason, who we're talking about today. But one thing that happened was that the free Black population of Los Angeles expanded greatly. So this was the beginnings of building a community. And by achieving her freedom, Biddy, who up until then was only called Biddy, took the last name Mason. Another small mystery. We're not quite sure why she took that name, but she was now a woman of a first and a last name. And she quickly got a very remunerative and respectable job. And I know Laura will be talking about that. But the other thing that I want to emphasize is that California law was not a freedom-giving law at that point. By defaulting, Robert Smith, he left town in the middle of the night, basically, by default. So no one wound up claiming these people at all, and they were, by his default, left unimprisoned, not illegally confined any longer. But one of the things that happened was that a very pro-slavery Southern California was outraged by the result, and you can see that reflected in the career of the judge who had presided over the case. But Robert Smith deserved it. He was a thug. He intimidated witnesses. He bribed lawyers. He showed up at the jail unannounced and tried to get people out. And he really was not a respectable character. Nonetheless, there were many people who threatened the free Black population with violence if they supported this case, and so on. So it really was controversial, and the judge took care. You can see it. His brother-in-law was John Griffin, right? So the judge took care to place these people in situations where they would not be too vulnerable to abuse and violence.
Okay, so I think this is the great segue to Laura and Jackie. Don't worry, we're going to come to you after Laura. But so you mentioned John Griffin, Sally. For those who don't know, I'll let Laura introduce him, but that he was essentially Biddy Mason's first employer, and also who happened to be the brother-in-law of the judge in her case. But as you kind of painted this picture, when Biddy earns her freedom, she's not placed in a Los Angeles that is welcoming, inclusive, or friendly to African Americans. So she has to find a way to make a living. And this is someone who's come from being enslaved. It's not like, she had been given all the tools and all the resources that she would have needed to be successful. And yet she ends up doing it anyway. And so I'd love for Laura, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about how I know that you people heard in the clip that you discovered Biddy Mason through this mural, and so you are introduced to Biddy as a healer. So can you describe Biddy's transition into being a healer and how you came into contact with her story?
Yeah, I think Sally mentioned in the recording just the evidence that they probably had really significant midwifing skills by the time she reached Southern California. Maybe learning on the job, maybe learning before she came to the Smiths. However it was, she definitely was a prominent person as a midwife among those who knew her. And she also had gained knowledge of traditional medicine, which was mostly herbal medicine at that point. As I talked about in the podcast, we don't exactly know how Griffin came to know about Biddy. Los Angeles was a fairly small community in those days. And so if she had opportunity to do either midwifery or any kind of healing in the community, Dr. Griffin would have heard about it. And the other part that is an interesting part of the story is that, and I think I said this in the podcast, is that Griffin probably kept his horse and carriage with Robert Owens in his stable. And since Biddy was staying with the Owens family, there's another avenue where word might have reached Griffin, but I imagine he heard pretty quickly that there was a woman with these talents in town. And as the only university-trained doctor and surgeon in town, he probably had more medical practice business than he knew what to do with. So I'm sure he welcomed the opportunity to add to his staff. In fact, she would have been the beginning of his staff.
Yes. And she does very well for herself as a healer, and she's able to put away a lot of money, which is part of her transition into becoming a real estate mogul. But I would like to, if it's okay with everyone, I'd like to take this moment to play another clip from the episode. And I think this will allow us to turn to you, Jackie, and talk about what Biddy starts to do with her money, which is part of why her story is so incredible. So let me see if I can. Can people see the screen? And I'm going to press play. Let's see if this works. After 10 years of working as a healer, saving up her money, making friends, and paying attention to the real estate around her, Biddy was ready.
She bought her first property in 1866. Land was still relatively cheap, and she came to own some properties in what's really now the heart of downtown Los Angeles.
Once she had bought her first property, she leveraged it to make money so she could buy more.
She was very entrepreneurial. She built storerooms and residential properties on her real estate, and then she used the rents from those properties to sort of seed other investments. She was bringing in money from her work as a nurse. She was bringing in money from the rents that she charged her tenants, and she may have even been making some money from commercial enterprises. For a woman who was never taught to read and write, I think remarkable doesn't begin to sort of capture it.
UPenn law professor Sarah Barringer Gordon agrees.
In the 19th century, women had limited legal rights, especially married women. In many jurisdictions, married women could not own property separately from their husbands. And Biddy, who never married after she was emancipated, became a significant property owner and property holder.
Jackie Broxton of the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation thinks that Biddy's desire to acquire property may be part of the reason that she never married as a free woman.
You know, a lot of white women have asked me, well, did Biddy ever get married? Did she find true love? And I said, I don't think she was looking for it. You know, she found comfort in being able to take care of herself and her children and provide a foundation for her family.
Biddy didn't believe in keeping her wealth just within her family. One of the first things she did when she purchased her own home was to open it up to LA's Black community for prayer meetings.
And then that graduated into a religious service. And from there, they actually later got a physical structure.
Out of Biddy's living room, the first African-American Methodist Episcopal congregation, or FAME Church, was born.
Okay, wonderful. So I should mention that you also heard the voice of Kevin Waite in that clip, who is Sally's co-author and co-director of the Biddy Mason Collaborative, and wasn't able to be here today. But thank you, Kevin, for participating. But turning to you, Jackie, I know Biddy Mason is a pivotal figure in your life. You kind of describe her as your North Star. If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about FAME Church and your relationship with FAME Church and how Biddy helped shape that institution.
Well, I think from the early days when the church began in 1872, because she had such a strong influence on the congregation, we adopted a phrase called first to serve. And to that day, we still pretty much try to honor that. She was a person like many slaves. They knew the value of property. They knew the value of community. And that was what kept them going. And I think the church is probably a very good example of that. When I first joined the church 40 years ago, they still had what they call states clubs, where all the people who originated in Arkansas were in one club. And they would compete in terms of fundraising with the people from Texas. You know, we don't do that too much now, but it was a wonderful way of bonding the congregation. And a lot of that, I think, stems from those early days with Biddy, because if you look on the list of slaves that came with Smith and the other Mormons, a number of those men later became trustees of the church. So it's interesting how it all kind of weaves together, but if you know the history, it's perfectly understandable.
Yeah, to what extent would you say that FAME Church had a role in shaping kind of early Los Angeles, especially for the Black community of Los Angeles at that time?
It's the oldest African-American congregation in the city. It definitely had a role in shaping Los Angeles, and it still does. We the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation came out of FAME. We initially started as a committee. And then as we realized we could do more, we became our own independent 501c3, but we still have very strong historical ties to the church.
Yeah, would you mind talking a little bit about that, Jackie? Why did the church want to have an organization dedicated to foster youth, and why was Biddy Mason the kind of namesake of the organization?
Well, the church has always had an interest in foster care, like many churches. They do things at Christmas, they do back to school drives and that kind of thing. But at the time, I was employed by an agency in Pasadena that's a little over 100 years old that started as an orphanage. And so every day I was looking at these kids who were in care. And one day I happened to be sitting in my office, which was upstairs, and I happened to look out the window, and there was a Hispanic girl sitting on a bench with very long hair and an African-American girl sitting next to her, and they were chatting. They looked to be about 14 years old. And then the African-American girl began stroking and braiding the Hispanic girl's hair. And if you're an African-American woman, you understand what that means. We have issues. We have very strong issues around hair. And I thought to myself, this child does not see herself as being worthy. She doesn't see herself as being attractive. And we got to do something about it. And we formed this little committee. We had no idea what we were going to do. We just knew we had to do something, because there's a whole issue of disproportionality in foster care in LA County. LA County has the largest foster care population in the nation. African Americans in LA County make up 10% of the population, but we make up 24% of the foster care population. So our mission was really to reach out and try to serve these kids.
And Biddy Mason's influence on that, how did she become the figure?
Yeah, Biddy Mason's influence was simply
Sorry. Try now, Jackie.
Can you hear me? Okay. She was separated from her family the way many of these kids are separated from their families. Yeah. And it's interesting, as we teach the young people about Biddy Mason, they frequently come back to us and say, if Biddy could do it, I can do it. So she has a definite influence on the organization and the youth we serve.
So Jackie, that makes me think that, there's not, as you were saying, people don't often know about Biddy Mason's story, despite the fact that it is such a powerful story and can have such a positive influence on people's lives, right? That's part of the reason why Decca and I wanted to do this podcast episode, is to raise awareness around Biddy's story and her role in shaping Los Angeles and Black Los Angeles. So I would love to talk with the panelists now about the ways in which Biddy is commemorated. What are the remnants of her life that are left in Los Angeles? And maybe Jackie, let's maybe start with you, if you wouldn't mind talking about potentially her headstone or any of the other initiatives that you're aware of.
Well, yes, her grave was unmarked for over 100 years. And the church and then Mayor Tom Bradley got together and they actually put a headstone on her grave. There is a park that's dedicated to her in downtown Los Angeles, but unfortunately, it's a pocket park. So you cannot see it from the street. So people travel up and down Broadway and Spring Street all day long, and they never realize that that park is there. And that was one of the main reasons that we decided to name the foundation after her, because we felt like everything we do, we have to mention her name, and then people become more conscious of who she was. Right. And in the house, we have a really large display of her life. But there is a move to rename Spring Street after her, but I'm not sure how much traction it has at this point.
Right. And we'll get into this with Ken Bernstein in a minute, I'm sure. But the Memorial Park is located where her first property was. And I believe we have the deed potentially as to that.
Spring, yes.
Mm-hmm. And the deed is up on the screen. Right. And so most of the places where her properties are, we don't necessarily know, right? But luckily we know where that one was, and that's where the Memorial Park is today. Before I turn to Ken and ask him a little bit about how Los Angeles is preserving these types of places, Laura, I do want to ask you one more question, because the mural in which you discovered kind of Biddy Mason that's also one way in which Biddy's memory is kept alive and commemorated. It's not a physical location, but at least it's a physical object that people can see and learn about her. So would you mind just introducing people to that a little bit, to the story of how you discovered Biddy in that mural and the work you had to do to keep it from being demolished?
Sure. I was not the first person to recognize that Biddy was in that mural, perhaps the first person in this moment to call people's attention to it. It was kind of a combination of Dr. Griffin's published journal, a couple of articles that Viola Lockhart Warren wrote that I had all read. And so that when I began researching all this, I realized there was a connectivity between them, in that the person who had written the foreword to Dr. Griffin's journal was also one of the team of advisors at UC San Francisco when the Zackheim was planning out the 10 series History of Medicine in California series. And so I began to put the dots together. It's like George D. Lyman knew who Griffin was, and he probably knew who Biddy was. When he died, Gillilock Warren probably picked up his notes because everything she wrote after that so reflected his work. And she names Biddy in an article, although she calls her Biddy Mason. So it all started pointing to the woman in this mural has to be Biddy. I don't know of any other woman of color who assisted him. She's right next to him. If it was Lyman and Viola Lockhart Warren, they knew it was Biddy. So I'm convinced that yes, they were portraying Biddy. I don't believe they had a photo of her. So it's a fairly generic image of what a Black nurse might have looked like in those days. But yeah, that's how I went, hey, wait, they're about to demolish this mural. And it's got like one of the very few images we have of Biddy in it. I think we need to do what we can to try and save this mural.
Yes, and as we're going to leave it on a cliffhanger there so people can go to the podcast episode and find out what happened when Laura discovers they're going to demolish the mural, because I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce Ken Bernstein to the audience. Let me see if I can get his slides up. Ken, would you mind going off of mute now and introducing yourself to the audience and talking a little bit about your work and the Los Angeles African American Historic Places Project?
Oh, thanks so much, Vanessa. It's such a pleasure to be joining all of you this afternoon. I lead the Office of Historic Resources for the City of Los Angeles. We're part of Los Angeles City Planning. And it's really an honor to talk about some of the work we're doing on some of the broader work about preserving African American heritage. And I see a lot of connections to this discussion this afternoon about Biddy Mason's heritage. I love the framing that Sarah gave this earlier, recovering history. That really is a big part of what we do in our program, and how we recover history and tie that back to place, and to use that recovery of history to shape the planning of the future of our cities. So we've been working on related initiatives for quite a while in Los Angeles. Over a decade, we have been partnering with the Getty, the J. Paul Getty Trust, through their Getty Conservation Institute and funding support from the Getty Foundation, to undertake Survey LA, which has been the first comprehensive inventory of historic resources throughout the city, looking at historic places of all kinds. And the survey results and the data from that work are found today at historicplacesla.org. And that's all been structured through a historic preservation framework that's called a historic context statement, which really is a way of distilling down everything that we know about history related to various themes, tying it back to place, to guide identification and possible designation of historic resources. And we have prepared in 2018 an African American history historic context, partnering with many communities in Los Angeles. This was also building upon a series of other ethnic and cultural themes that we had developed through Survey LA for Latino Los Angeles, 5 Asian American historic context, the first LGBT context for any major city in the country. And that context drew out the African American context, about 9 themes that kind of distill down African American history, segregation and deed restriction, the civil rights movement, religion and spirituality, healthcare. It just strikes me how much of Biddy Mason's story is woven into each of these themes in the way you've already discussed today, whether it's healthcare, her role as a healthcare provider, her role in creating the Black church in Los Angeles, the legal struggle for emancipation. Her story is reflected in that context, but it really plays a central role in many of these themes. So on the one hand, we're very proud of some of the work that we've done toward African American heritage in the city, but we also have a long way to go, and we recognize that only about 3% of our designated landmarks, our local, what we call historic cultural monuments in Los Angeles, are places associated with African American heritage. So we began discussions with the Getty a year or two ago about ways that we could extend our long partnership to rectify some of these disparities. And that is what became Los Angeles African American Historic Places, which is going to be pursuing 3 sets of activities. One is to broaden and deepen some of that work on the context that I already mentioned, to take in more stories, more themes, and to really allow us to deepen some of our community engagement around those topics. Second is to recover history, if you will, by by advancing many of these places to formal historic designation, but being able to take on more local landmark nominations and to have consultants and professionals partner with communities to make that possible. And then third, to develop comprehensive, what we call cultural preservation strategies in local neighborhoods that are historically African-American neighborhoods, kind of going beyond the traditional ways of doing historic preservation in terms of historic designation, to also look at intangible heritage and cultural traditions, interpretive programs, preserving legacy businesses and communities, mapping other cultural assets, looking at those broader strategies, and as well as to look at all of our historic preservation processes and practices through an anti-racist lens to make sure that we're not creating unintended barriers to our processes or economic inequities as a result of these processes. And so all of this on this slide here, you see Rita Cofield. We have brought her on through the Getty and the city, really working with both institutions to help really be the project leader for this new initiative. Rita is someone who brings community-based experience in the Watts community, advancing a site called the Mafundi Institute, the Watts Happening Cultural Center and Watts Coffee House to historic designation not long ago. She also comes out of the historic preservation community and is on the board of the California Preservation Foundation. So she's really an ideal person to help lead this change and work with a 15-member advisory committee to make this all possible. But I just want to make, just before we go to questions, just to mention that what we're really trying to do is to elevate not only Biddy Mason's story, but so many other stories that have been untold or underappreciated, and just a couple of others that are in our existing 2018 historic context. Other remarkable African-American women. The deed restrictions and racial segregation theme that we developed tells the story of Hattie McDaniel, the actress, Academy Award-winning actress from Gone with the Wind, who played a key role in breaking down racially restrictive covenants in the city, in the Sugar Hill neighborhood, working with the attorney Lauren Miller, who's kind of the Thurgood Marshall of LA, to take on a landmark court case that broke down racial segregation through racially restrictive covenants with some of her neighbors in Sugar Hill. And then our theme on newspapers in the African-American community, which are such an important source of communication, tells the story of Charlotta Bass, who with her husband Joseph was the owner of the California Eagle newspaper, and she ran that paper for about 2 decades after he passed away. And it was an amazing source of communication for the community. But she was also 6 decades or so ahead of Kamala Harris, the first African-American woman to be on a presidential ticket in America. She was the vice presidential candidate for the Progressive Party in 1952, and her home in South LA, like the home of Hattie McDaniel, have been identified through our work. We'd love to see those designated through this effort. So those are 2 examples of many.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ken. Before I turn us over to the audience Q&A, so everyone get ready, get your questions in that chat, get them prepped. I just want to quickly comment on some of the things you said. First of all, the idea that you brought up, that there's so much kind of intangible heritage that is no longer existing. And that was one of the challenges of the Biddy Mason episodes for us, right? Because so often we use a building, a physical place, to anchor our episode, to talk about this building needs to be preserved because it represents this history. But sometimes the history matters, but the buildings are no longer there. And it's really hard for the preservation community to grapple with that, right? What do you do when the building is gone? How do you do the work, the quote unquote work of preservation, when there's no physical structures? And so that's part of what we try to do with the Urban Roots podcast, is kind of bridge that gap a little bit and tell these stories, and interview people for whom these places were meaningful, even if they're no longer still standing. So that I thought was a really important point to bring up. And just to mention, just because people are in this event, if they're Urban Roots fans, you mentioned the Sugar Hill neighborhood. We're considering a Sugar Hill episode in season 3. So if that's something of interest to fans, then put it in the chat and we'll see if maybe we'll pursue that. So but yes, I'd love to open the floor to the audience. So you can ask questions to any and all of us. We are open books here. You can ask us about Biddy Mason and more about her life. You can ask us about the Urban Roots podcast, about the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation, the work that they do, the Biddy Mason Collaborative, how they're keeping Biddy's story alive. Or you can ask some questions to Ken about the Los Angeles African American Historic Places Project. So Decca, do we have a burning first question for us yet?
I believe we do. Somebody said Dr. Barringer Gordon mentioned that after Mason died, her estate was probated. What do we know about her heirs and the property she owned? Maybe you could speak a little bit more to like the properties. I think Sally.
Of course I could, and it's a great question. She had a very professional will drawn up. It's clear that a talented lawyer did it and that she thought deeply about what she wanted done. So well before she died, she transferred some of her properties, especially to her two grandsons, both of whom were made executors of her will. And she was very clear about what she wanted to have happen, that each member of her family would be taken care of, would have a place on this property, and that her grandsons were empowered to do. One of the grandsons, his father wanted him to be a farmer or to continue the horse business, feeding and training and stabling that was so central to the Owens family. And there's a great story that he tells of Biddy telling his father to stop picking on his son. He was never going to be a farmer. Let him do what he wanted to do. Let him become himself. And so one of the things you see in her will is how deeply she thinks about every member of her family, what she wants to leave them, how she wants to show them her love. And the only thing I want to add to that, and so it was probated, everything went through. The only thing I want to add is that was consistent with her entire life. And having read some of Jackie's plays, for example, having read reminiscences from other people, this was a woman who, when she saw people who were hungry, she fed them. When their property was damaged after floods, she helped them rebuild. When new people arrived without clothing, without money, she took them in. So she was a woman who gave constantly, who was generous, so generous that when she was ill, right before her death, her grandson complained that the people lined up to visit her and talk to her went around the block. So her will is evidence, yet more evidence of her charm, of her thoughtfulness, of her generosity, and of her great attention and care for her family.
Thank you, Sally. Do we have another question, Decca?
Yeah. So in the podcast, we talked about the Owens family, and we have a question about, could you tell us a little bit more about the Owens family, who they were before and or after Biddy met them? Maybe Jackie, would you like to take that one first?
Okay. Robert Owens was able to purchase his freedom. He was originally from Texas, and he was able to purchase his freedom, and he moved to California, where he started a livery business. You know, in those days, there were no cars, so everybody had a horse. And he was able to build that business to the point where he was able to purchase the rest of his family. So he was definitely up and coming in the area when Biddy arrived. Well, there's a love story here. Biddy's daughter, Ellen, fell in love with his son, Robert. And we also feel that precipitated the midnight raid on the Mormon camp that later found them placed in the LA County Jail for safety. So there's a definite love story that's built around that. And the Owens family became very prominent. And when Ellen actually married into that family, they were a powerhouse in the area, the two families. And one other thing I wanted to add, we have a reproduction of the Zakai mural that depicts Biddy Mason in our facility. The university was kind enough to give us a digital image that we had reproduced. So those of you who live in Los Angeles are welcome to come and see the reproduction of the mural.
Yeah, I think in the house where you are now, you have lots of kind of namesakes about Biddy's life. So yeah, definitely encourage people to check that out if they want to know more about Biddy's story and actually see some of the physical objects that are associated with her life. Wonderful. Laura, did you want to add anything about the Owens or Sally or?
If anybody hasn't listened to the podcast yet, I would ask Jackie to just share with us what Biddy's motto was, because I think it's so appropriate to the way Sally was characterizing her.
The open hand is blessed because it gives as it receives.
The open hand is blessed because it gives as it receives. Beautiful.
And I feel like we're all blessed because of what we received from Biddy, and this opportunity to talk together about her.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question if there is one, Decca.
Yeah, so we've been asked, have you thought about pitching this to PBS or own history for documentary? So this is a good one for, I think, all of us now that we're kind of like we kind of become part of this, Biddy Mason Collaborative by, default, by having really covered the story and having included so many of these awesome people who've you guys have met, Sally, Laura, and Jackie here today. But so this is a question, I guess, for all of us, whoever wants to answer, podcast or the rest of the collaborative.
I'd love to pick up on that, in part because one of the things we've learned, and Ken mentioned it, but the Mellon Foundation also did a survey of commemorative monuments around the country that very much mirrors what Los Angeles also has built, which is not enough to reflect what really happened here and how invigorating it can be to see new work, especially by artists, musicians, and so on, celebrating, recovering. I'm thinking of the wonderful portrait of Biddy done by Elizabeth Columba, which was exhibited at LACMA recently and is held privately in Los Angeles. It's a beautiful painting. There's a digital installation in Magic Johnson Park, funded by the Mellon Foundation. We need more of this. We need to reach out to future generations to give them a sense of how much has been done by people who cared about them and about their futures, that wanted to build bright futures for everyone. So I really do think that commemorating is extremely important. And I've loved the historic places presentation. I've used it several times in the classroom, Ken. I've used Jackie, your play in the classroom, and Laura, your work on the mural is just incredibly important, but we do need more. And I think the PBS idea is terrific. I really do. And I thank you for your suggestion.
Maybe one last rapid fire, if all the panelists wouldn't mind answering very, very quickly. If you had all the money and power in the world, what's one thing you would do to commemorate Biddy Mason? I'll start with I'm going to go right to left on my screen. So sorry, Ken, you're up first.
Oh boy. I just really quickly, I do think, like was said, the fact that the Power Place project is a pocket park, it's wonderful, but it would be great, maybe just a small step to bring that presence to the street in some way and make it more visible. So that maybe isn't a huge investment, but just a simple step.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take your quick fire answer. I will charge you to imagine bigger next time,
Okay.
Ken. I said all the money in the world, but no, street activation is super, super important. So I think even if you do have all the money in the world, being able to interact with her on a daily basis like that, I can understand it's like very pivotal. Laura, your rapid fire answer.
Yeah, I would find out how much money it takes to get those 10 mural panels out of storage and into a prominent location in San Francisco so everyone can see them, properly interpret them, and put them on a digital site where you can walk up with your phone and get the full story of Biddy and even this podcast.
I love Laura. You're ready for that. Jackie, what would you do?
Two things. I would like a life-size mural of Biddy Mason at the intersection of the 10 and Harbor Freeway, and that she be written into California state curriculum.
Yes.
Nice.
I like that. Sally?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so of course I always think in those terms, but California has an impressive, admirable, and very consequential reparations program. And I think bringing Biddy front and center, especially the fact that California is very interested in recovering property and using that as part of a more sustained and fair recognition of the state's past. I would want to bring Biddy into that campaign and begin to actually take her really seriously at a state as well as at a city level.
Thank you all so much for your time, for being here, for teaching us about Biddy, Ken, for teaching us about your project in Los Angeles's work here. It's super important. Just as this final screen, just wanted to let you know how you can get in touch with us at Urban Roots or Jackie at the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation if you want to throw some dollars their way. Wouldn't say no, I bet. So you can screenshot this screen if you're looking at this and want to get in touch with us later. And I did want to briefly mention that this is our first Listen and Learn. We really hope you liked it. We'll probably send out a survey to folks, see what we can improve, because we do have another event in 1 week's time. Just quickly put up the screen, all about Greenwood Cemetery's Freedom Lots. That's in Brooklyn, New York. So if you want to know more about a little known story of urban history, join us next week for that. But that's all. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate you all being here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.